Hello, everyone. We're going to start in about 15 or 20 seconds while we wait for people to join. Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone around the world. My name is Rick Richmond. I'm a resident scholar at American Jewish University. This is the fifth in the seven-part series on the Seven Front War against Israel, jointly presented by the Middle East Forum and AJU. Today we'll be addressing the Iraqi front with a presentation by Jonathan Spire, Director of Research at the Middle East Forum and editor of its Middle East Quarterly. The Quarterly is an essential resource. It's peer-reviewed, open source, available to anyone who signs up for it at the MEF website, and I heartily recommend it to those of you not already subscribing. We couldn't have a better speaker on Iraq today than Jonathan. He is the author of a 2018 book entitled Days of the Fall, A Reporter's Journey in the Syria and Iraq Wars. It was a result of 5 years of reporting in Baghdad, Damascus, Mosul, and other frontline areas. And among other things, Jonathan witnessed the emergence of the Shia militias in Iraq as a key force in the region, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that in due course. We will put up links to the Middle East Quarterly and to Jonathan's book in the chat function on your screen. I'm going to turn this over in a minute to Jonathan for about 15 minutes for his presentation, and then we'll have a colloquy for another few minutes, and we'll save the final 10 minutes for your questions, which you can put in the Zoom Q&A function. So Jonathan, please proceed. We're very interested and very fortunate to hear your analysis and thoughts today on the Iraq front.
Thank you very much, Rick. So what I thought I'd do is just start with a very brief historical whistle-stop tour through the last decades of Iraqi history to understand and set us up for the discussion. And let's remember that Iraq, a country of 46 million people, so a sizable country in the heart, very much the geographical heartland of the Middle East, the modern state of Iraq, established in 1921 by the British, when the British and French were carving up the recently deceased Ottoman Empire, and Iraq becoming then independent in 1947. Iraq was, of course, a Hashemite monarchy, like Jordan is today. King Faisal was the king. The monarchy held until 1958, when, in essence, in my estimation at least, the travails, if I can put it that way, of Iraq begin, and they've never ended since then. In 1958, General Abdul Karim Qasim brings down the monarchy. There is a slaughter of the royal family in Baghdad. And Qasim, then an Arab nationalist general of the type that was proliferating in the region, at that time holds power till 63, and in 1963 he's brought down by the Arab Ba'ath Party, the revival party, the famous Ba'ath Party that, of course, in name still rules in Syria and in Iraq, ruled from 63 with a little bit of instability in between. We tend to say 69 was when the Ba'ath really consolidated its power in Iraq. And of course, it's within the context of the Ba'ath Party that the Ba'ath activist, Saddam Hussein from Tikrit, rises up. And by 1979, Saddam is in power in the context of Ba'ath Party, but basically ruling as a one-man show. Saddam famously takes Iraq to disaster in a number of steps. The first of those is the declaration of war against Iran, newly revolutionary Iran, in 1980, an 8-year war in which 500,000 Iraqis lose their lives and 1 million Iranians. The next stage of disaster, of course, Saddam's invasion of Kuwait in 1991, triggering the first Gulf War. And then in 2003, ushering in the phase in which we are going to spend most of our discussion, of course, the United States chooses, in the aftermath of the 9/11 terror attacks in New York, to launch an invasion of Iraq. The Saddam regime is destroyed, and the current phase of Iraqi history begins. Number of points then on what's currently taking place in the last last couple of decades. I mean, there have been a number of freely held elections, of course, in Iraq since 2003. Prior to 2003, there had never been elections. In 2005, first one, 2010, 2014, 18, and then 21. So from that point of view, things look good, right? 5 internationally observed, democratically held elections have taken place. In practice, however, things are not anywhere like as optimal as that sounds. Iraq has been essentially in chaos since 2003. And the reason why it has been in chaos, in my estimation at least, and not only mine, is because the US invasion and destruction of Saddam upset a certain balance, maybe not a just balance, but a certain balance that had held in Iraq until that point. And that balance was that Iraq was dominated by the Sunni Arab minority up until 2003. And with the destruction of Saddam, the ascendancy of the Sunni Arab community in Iraq ended. Iraq is a very divided society. There are many ethnicities in Iraq, but there are 3 main groups that we should be thinking about. There are Iraqi Kurds, who are 15 to 20% of the society, and then the remaining 80% is for the most part, Arabic-speaking Iraqis, who are then further subdivided into a Shia majority and a Sunni minority. That Sunni minority had held power throughout Iraq's history until 2003. When Saddam goes and democracy or elections begin, it becomes an inevitability that the Shia will be the ascendant because they are the ascendant population. But this has not in any way been accepted by the other communities. And instead, what you have in Iraq today is a sort of 3-way ethno-sectarian conflict, which began really pretty much the moment that Saddam was deposed. In addition, there was, of course, a dual insurgency against the American presence, a Sunni insurgency and a rival Shia insurgency. And at the same time that both insurgencies were fighting the United States, they were also fighting each other. There was a sectarian civil war going on during the American occupation at the same time that there were 2 insurgencies going on against the Americans. By the way, the Kurdish population, by contrast, was overwhelmingly pro-American and remains so because they saw and see the Americans as the ones who have delivered them from the brutal dictatorship of Saddam, which committed heinous murders against the Kurdish community. So if we think of what's happened in Iraq since the invasion, we think of insurgencies, and then in 2011, under President Obama, the Americans choose to leave and depart from Iraq. In 2014, the Americans come back. Why? Because a Sunni Arab reaction has grown up and is now challenging the Shia-dominated new Iraq. What was this Sunni Arab reaction? Everybody's heard of ISIS. This was ISIS. Dawla al-Islamiyya fi Iraq wa Sham, or the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. We tend to think of ISIS as all kinds of things. Remember, first and foremost, ISIS was an Iraqi organization and is an Iraqi organization created by Iraqis and led by Iraqis throughout its existence. And in Iraq in 2014, the form that ISIS was taking was the reaction of the Sunni Arabs who had lost power in 2003 and who were rising up against the new Shia ascendancy. The Americans came back, of course, in 2014, and together with the Shia-dominated Iraqi armed forces, they defeated ISIS and destroyed it and drove it out of Iraq down to Syria, to the lower Euphrates River Valley, and then fought it to the end. The result then has been the rise of, or since then, has been the now almost uncontested rise to ascendancy of Shia political forces in Iraq based on the demographic ascendancy of the Shia. But the nature of, and this is the bad news, I guess, the nature of Shia politics in post-Saddam Iraq has come to be more and more dominated by the influence of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Militarily and politically, everybody listening is familiar with the Iranian method, adapted to local conditions, which is being applied throughout the Middle East, in which the Iranians combine political and military capacities under one roof and then push that forward to achieve power for themselves. They've applied a version of it in Lebanon, a version of it in Yemen, a version of it in Syria, a version of it among the Palestinians, all adapted to local conditions. There is also a variety which is being advanced in Iraq. And the advance of Iranian-backed forces to ascendancy in Iraq is now very much forward indeed. the Iranians have made use cleverly of factors on the ground. When ISIS rose up, Ayatollah Sistani, alias Sistani, who is a very major Shia cleric in Iraq, who is not by any means a puppet or client of the Iranians, but Ayatollah Sistani issued what was called a jihad fatwa, let's say a religious ruling calling young Iraqis, Iraqi Shia, to jihad, to fight against ISIS, to defend the community against ISIS. In the framework of that massive mobilization of nearly 200,000 young Iraqi Shia, Iran-supported militias began to organize. They were already in existence. They began to massively expand their number in the framework of what was called and is called the Popular Mobilization Units, or Hashd Shabi, a kind of parallel army of the kind that the Iranians like to build in countries where they wish to build influence, emerged. And Iran-supported militias quickly rose to be the dominant forces within that PMU, Popular Mobilization Units. People probably remember the name Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. This was the man who was killed together with General Qasem Soleimani on the road from Baghdad airport in January 2020 by American Hellfire missiles. Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis was no lesser figure than Qasem Soleimani in his own way in the Iraqi context. He was Iran's #1 man in the military mobilization that was the Popular Mobilization Units that brought Iranian military power permanently mobilized on the ground into Iraq as a usable asset for Islamic Republic of Iran in exactly the same way and in a parallel way to the role played by Lebanese Hezbollah in the smaller but similar Lebanese context. That's the military half of this. There's a political side as well. In 2021, in the most recent Iraqi elections, the coordination framework, which was essentially the Iraqi Shia militias mustered as a political party, as a political force, did not win a majority in the 328-seat Iraqi parliament. But as a result of various shenanigans involving other quite dubious Shia political forces, most importantly Muqtada Sadr, a name probably familiar to people here, to cut a long story short, by 2022, the Iran-supported Shia militias had risen to form the current Iraqi government. Prime Minister Mohammed Shia Sudani, who is the current Prime Minister of Iraq, rules as a result of his leading of the his being the candidate of the coordination framework. The coordination framework is nothing more or less than the Iraqi Shia militias mustered for political purposes. Therefore, what we can say as we begin to, as I conclude this small or the short briefing, is that today the Islamic Republic of Iran is in the ascendant in Iraq for the following reasons, which we've touched on in the course of this talk. One, the traditional Sunni dominance of Iraq was destroyed by the American invasion, and the Shia are a majority, a demographic majority in Iraq, so they naturally would dominate under an electoral system. Two, the Islamic Republic of Iran has organized in its own inimitable fashion better than anybody else within the dominant Shia community. Three, the ISIS uprising enabled the Iranians to organize militarily on the ground in Iraq. And of course, the Iranians, as we know, when they organize militarily, never demobilize. They mobilize for a particular context, but then they stay mobilized forever to serve the interests of Islamic Republic of Iran. And then the militias organizing politically proved to be the most smart and most astute political actor on the Shia stage, as a result, assuming government in 2022 to a situation which exists in Iraq now, where you have the Iranian interest dominating the parliament, dominating the government, and maintaining its own parallel army, the Popular Mobilization Units that I mentioned a moment ago, which many would say is now becoming stronger than the national army itself. If all of this sounds familiar, that's because it is, because we've seen a similar process taking place in Lebanon over the last half century. In Lebanon, it's already far more advanced. The Iranian domination is almost complete. In Iraq, that's not quite the case yet. But as a result of the factors I mentioned, the Islamic Republic of Iran is advancing forward in Iraq. And today, I would say it and its friends are the most powerful and notable factor on the Iraqi political stage. I could go on and on, but I guess I'll leave it at that because I see we're at 15 minutes after the hour, and we can move on to our conversation. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. It was a fascinating tour de horizon of a very complicated area. I must say that it rings true not only in retrospect as you're explicating it now, but you're one of the few who saw it, I think, coming, because I look back at a June 27, 2021 article that you wrote in the Jerusalem Post, in which you said the Iranian strategy for Iraq was clear and resembling exactly what they were doing in Lebanon. Um,
Yeah.
explicate a little bit more the strategy in Lebanon and the strategy in Iraq, and maybe the strategy to come in some of the other fronts in this war. What was the similar? What were they trying to achieve, and what were they not trying to achieve as part of their strategy?
Yeah, thanks, Rick. Well, it's interesting that the Chinese have a term for the strategy they pursue, which they call civil military fusion. Uh, for the Chinese, it means many different things, but the Iranians have a version of that as well, civil military fusion, which means that the instruments they create in the various contexts in which they wish to build power, in essence, are armed political parties, structures which combine both political and military capacity under a single roof. And then they use the one to multiply the power of the other. It goes both ways. The military multiplies the political power, because a political party with its own army is an inherently more powerful instrument than a political party that does not have an army, right? But the political multiplies the military as well, because when the political party gets into power, then what it, of course, starts to do, now commanding the massive budgets characteristic of a state, is it begins to channel resources and money towards the military force associated with the political party, which then begins to grow until eventually it grows larger than the official military forces of the state. And at that point, of course, if you can get to that point, if you're running a project like that, you then become unassailable. Right, nobody can get rid of you at that point, because you have political power, and if other parties try and object to you, you have military muscle as well. Look at the way that Hezbollah, for example, took over West Beirut in 2008 when its political opponents tried to oppose one of its decisions. So in Iraq, that structure, that path exactly is being followed. You're correct that this is one of the things, I occasionally get things right, and this is one of the things which I noticed coming pretty early, all the way back to 2015. When just a year after the jihad fatwa, I did a research project for a thing called Jane's Information Group, a defense intelligence company, which I do sometimes some work for, on the Iraqi Shia militias. And I went there to Baghdad and to Anbar. The ISIS war was still on. All my fellow journalists were busy writing about ISIS. And I went to write about the Shia militias. And I interviewed the late Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes at that time and other senior Shia militia commanders. And I had really a bird's eye view. They were very candid at that time of, in a sense, the birth of that, or early stages of that Iranian militia push for power, which is now so advanced in the Iraqi context.
As I understand what you've written, I think you've perceptively said that Iran was not looking to replace the states of Lebanon or Iraq or Yemen, for that matter. They were trying to create a state that wouldn't function to preclude them from doing what they wanted to do, which was to move men and material across that land to places where they could use it in a fight against Israel, and not have those states function to stop that. And so
Yeah,
while the West was looking at something that wasn't succeeding, they weren't replacing these states. In fact, they were succeeding in the sense that they were creating this ability to transfer the material for a larger war. So
absolutely right. I mean, the West was just caught. Yeah, sorry, please go
no,
ahead.
go ahead, keep going.
I was going to say that, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, the West, it was really quite frustrating for observers who could see what was going on, who had grasped this dynamic, because Western analysis, both on governmental level, I mean, the Western embassies in Baghdad and in Beirut, and also the media, and also the academia, were just not seeing this. They were constantly looking at things that were not real. I remember after the ISIS war concluded, I think on Time magazine, they put the guy on the cover, Prime Minister Haider al-Abadi, who was the current kind of puppet Iraqi prime minister at the time. And they hailed, this is Prime Minister Abadi. He's seen off ISIS. He's the man who's going to save Iraq. And people who knew were just saying, this is just nonsense. This has nothing to do with the actual dynamic of power. And my sense with the current war, which Israel is facing, is now everybody kind of sees it. Hopefully it's not too late. And now everybody you can't miss it now, that there is an Iran controlled structure of military and political power across the Arabic-speaking world, which is now mobilizing to fight Israel. But for so long, people literally denied the existence of this process. You would be told you were being simplistic, or you were reading much into this small piece of evidence, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it was frustrating. That's exactly how it was.
Well, so what we've used as a logo for this series is a map of the Middle East, and you can see Iran, which looms very large physically on the right of the map, and then Iraq, which is next to it, and then Syria, and then down to Lebanon, which is into the north of Israel. And I think that we in the West may have thought that the purpose of that was to create what the so-called land bridge from Iran to the Mediterranean. But what the map also shows is that if you look at the southwestern part of Iraq, it's as close to Israel as Lebanon is in the north or Syria is. And you can one can use the southwestern part of Iraq not simply as a transit place, but as a place to launch attacks from. And so my question to you is, to what extent has Iran done this? To what extent has the southwestern part of Iraq been militarized by Iran as part of this process?
It has, the southwest, and also all the way up through the central part of the west of Iraq as well, because as you correctly point out, measure it on the map, this brings Israel within Iranian missile range. And it serves, of course, the Iranian purpose to have the missiles being fired, not by Iranians, but by Iraqi Shia Arabs, who from an Iranian point of view are deniable and are also dispensable or disposable. The Iranians couldn't care less how many Iraqi Shia Arabs get killed. And also they can say it's not us, it's some independent militia carrying it out. Absolutely, yes. It's crucial to understand that a key point about this ascendancy of the Iranian force in Iraq is that the Iraqi Shia militias and their IRGC patrons now have freedom of movement throughout Iraq. In other words, if the Iranians or the militias / the militias want to deploy missiles in the deserts of western and southwestern Iraq, there is no force in Iraq able to or willing to or wishing to oppose them. I can remember for myself, we don't want to get too much into anecdotes, but during the ISIS war, during my project on the Shia militias, I remember we drove outside of Baghdad with people from Kataib Hezbollah on one occasion on the way to Anbar province where they were fighting. And immediately outside of the city limits of Iraq, the guys got out, put on uniforms, and took out Kalashnikovs. And that's pretty much tells you all you need to know. The remit of the Iraqi government, and then the Iranians didn't have the control of the Iraqi government itself, only extended, if it extended at all, to the city limits of Baghdad. Outside of that, the Iraqi Shia militias and the Iranians did exactly what they wanted. And that's up to and including the deployment of missiles in Western Iraq, which has already taken place. There have already, of course, been missile launches by the Iraqi Shia militias against Israel sporadically so far. The Shia militias are more concerned, by the way, right now with hitting the American presence in Iraq and in Syria than in hitting Israel. They want to hit Israel too. But the potential is very much there. If the wheels really come off this thing, regionally, which they haven't done yet. There is an Iranian mobilization, but it's not a 100% mobilization yet for reasons we can go into. But if the wheels really come off this thing, then the Iraqi Shia militias can form yet a major component of Iranian missile power to be directed against Israel.
There are about 2,500 U.S. troops, I believe, still in Iraq. What are they doing there? What is their function? Yes. Where are they located? And what's the what's going to happen with them?
Well, increasingly they're being pulled back into northern Iraq, into Iraqi Kurdistan, because many of the outlying positions outside of the northern part of Iraq were becoming a little bit too hot, a little bit too vulnerable. They're contained in a number of bases, in Erbil, in the famous Ain al-Assad base, and a number of others. Their function ostensibly is to take part and help in the ongoing fight against ISIS. But of course, ISIS is now largely a spent force, at least for now. I would say that the logic now really of the presence of that force is, or at least it ought to be, the logic ought to be that it is part of and should be part of an ongoing effort by the Americans and their regional allies to contest the ownership of Iraq against the Iranians. That's, I think, what that force needs to be part of. I think the problem, at least from where I sit, is that the United States, the current United States administration, doesn't yet really have strategic clarity in that regard. In other words, it doesn't yet see the region as an arena in which the West and its allies must contest and must roll back the Iranian advance. It has various other ways of looking at it. And unless you have that clarity of vision, it's very hard to see why these 2,500 service personnel are there. And indeed, there are those in the American discussion who have the view that, well, we're just leaving our people there to be targets for no apparent reason. So unless you have the Iranian project front and center in your vision, it's difficult to find a reason why those guys should be there, because actually for fighting against ISIS, there's not really a need for them anymore.
So you have 2,500 U.S. troops that are probably too small a number to effectuate any strategy, but large enough that they represent sitting ducks and possible hostages that can be taken by Iran or by militias. So you have a very strange situation of no strategy and implementation that may be counterproductive.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I do think there is this absence of strategy and absence of clarity is very, very notable in the Iraqi context. Just recently, Prime Minister Mohammed Shia Sudani, for example, was given the red carpet treatment in Washington, D.C., and he met with President Joe Biden, who praised him in the public part of the meeting afterwards for being a champion of Iraqi independence and a champion of Iraqi energy independence and so on and so forth. And at the same time that that was happening, you know, the Iraqi Shia militias from Iraq, who are part of Sudani's government, let's say in their political form, they're in the government, were launching missiles at United States forces in Syria. In that case, it was the Iraqi Shia militias launching missiles at the U.S. deployment of 900 troops in Syria. So it is very strange. The absence of clarity here is very strange, and I think probably contributes to the fact that the Iranians are the ones who keep on winning, because they know exactly what they're trying to do, and their opponents still aren't quite clear of what's going on.
So one of the questions we've gotten from one of the viewers is what should the U.S. be doing in Iraq? Should we be withdrawing the 2,500? Should we be increasing it? Should we what if we had strategic clarity in your view? What would that clarity be, and how would we implement it?
My view is that in the Iraqi context, unlike in Lebanon, where it's pretty much a done deal, in the Iraqi context, there are still forces that the United States and its allies can work with. It doesn't necessarily mean in terms of deploying conventional US military force into the area. There are other ways to project power. The Iranians, for example, don't have large conventional Iranian forces in Iraq, but they're kind of running the country. They're doing it through political influence. There are political actors in Iraq, and there are military factors within the Iraqi military as well, such as the counterterrorism service, which is a force pretty much created by and trained by the Americans. These forces still exist. The political forces still exist. But what needs to happen is they need to be united, be brought together for a united strategy to challenge the Iranian component. That's not currently happening. It can't just be America, and it's not America's job only, by the way. I mean, this should be a project in which the Gulf Arabs, in terms of their financial muscle, should be part of it as well. They understand the importance of not ceding Iraq to the Iranians. They should be part of it as well. By the way, Iraqi Kurdish forces also, such as the Kurdish regional government and Masoud Barzani's Peshmerga forces, you know, these are, in my opinion, are also available for mobilization by any Western forward strategy worth its salt that wishes to get going. The problem is not in the Iraqi context. The problem is not the absence of available assets. There are available assets. The problem is that the assets are currently not united, are disparate, are dissipated. Some of them end up working with the Iranians because they don't see any way forward otherwise. So the need is for us, once the decision is made to try to roll back the Iranian influence in Iraq, I say Iraq, it's not true of every country where they have influence, but in Iraq it is true. There are available assets to be made use of, in my estimation.
You know, I think we might be in the midst of a three-step process where the third step will be, once places like southwestern or even central Iraq has been mobilized to serve Iran's purposes and given missiles and drones and in some cases cruise missiles, that they would not simply be a front, one of the seven fronts and that none of the fronts would be one of the 7 fronts, but there would be a coordinated attack by
That's
one
right.
or more or all of these fronts. And I think last week there was a coordinated attack from the Iranian militias in Iraq against Eilat and Ashdod that
Yes.
was joined in by the Houthis. So
Whether it is, yes.
yeah, so
Yeah.
we may be only in the middle of a process, not a war that is starting to end in Gaza, but simply the first stage.
I think very much so. And I remind everyone that when we talk about 7 fronts, let's remember that the Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq are geographically essentially one front. That's to say, they are one contiguous land area, and the Iranians have contiguous freedom of movement throughout all 3 of them, all the way from the Iraq-Iran border, all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, and all the way to the border with Israel. So in that sense, we're already seeing a kind of coordination and coming together of these fronts.
Well, we're going to have to end this fascinating discussion. Seems like we've only begun. But let me just tell our viewers that next Monday, June 24th, same time, same place, we'll be discussing Lebanon with Robert Rabbi, professor of Middle East Studies at Florida Atlantic University, who has a doctorate in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis. He's appeared on Fox News, MSNBC, NPR, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and other major media networks. And Lebanon, of course, is heating up. And then on the following Monday, July 1st, we'll close this 7-part series with a discussion of Yemen presented by Michael Rubin of the Middle East Forum, who presented our first program in this series on Iran. You can sign up for these at aju.edu, and we hope you all will join us. Thank you very, very much, Jonathan Spire, for a very knowledgeable and fascinating discussion, and thank all of the rest of you for attending today.
Thanks, Rick.